Hey, what's up everyone? Kason here, and today I'm going to talk about the differences between the iPad 7th generation, the 10.2-inch screen version, and the iPad Air. Both of these are physically the same size, and a lot of people are asking what exactly are the differences between the two, especially because there's quite a big price difference. So I've got them both here in front of me, and I'm just going to do a little bit of a comparison so you can see exactly what the differences are and if it's worth paying the extra for the iPad Air or if you'd be just fine using the regular 10.2-inch iPad. At first glance, the most obvious difference between these two iPads is, of course, the price. The 7th generation iPad starts at $329 for the 32GB model, and you can upgrade that to 128GB, which is 4 times as much, for $100 more. So $429 will get you the 128GB version of this iPad. Now that still comes in under the $499 price of the entry-level iPad Air, and that will get you 64GB of storage. For an extra $150, you can upgrade that iPad to the 256GB model. So you get 256GB of storage for $649 on the iPad Air. So it's a bigger step up, but you're also getting quadruple the size of storage both ways. So those are the two price models that they have between the regular iPad and the iPad Air. Both of these iPads support the Apple Pencil, as well as now with the 7th generation iPad, the Smart Keyboard. Both of these are super awesome accessories, and I love using both of them, but they're pretty expensive. The Apple Pencil starts at $99. This is the 1st generation Apple Pencil, not the second one, so it is the weird one that you charge by plugging into the bottom of the iPad, not magnetically on the side. But it starts at $99, and the iPad Smart Keyboard, which folds up as a cover but also unfolds as a keyboard, is $149. You don't necessarily have to buy the Apple branded Smart Keyboard. There are a lot of keyboards out there, but one thing that this guy has an advantage over most keyboards is that it uses the Smart Connector, which is now on both the iPad Air and the 7th generation iPad, so that this guy doesn't ever need to be charged. You don't have to pair it over Bluetooth or anything like that. If it's connected to your iPad, it's working, and it just works seamlessly, and it's awesome. I've been using both of these iPads side by side for a little while now, just so I can see what areas you're going to notice the most difference between these two. And the top 3 areas where I found the most contrast between these two iPads are in display quality, storage capacity, and processor power. And really, in that order. The biggest thing that I really enjoyed about the iPad Air over the 7th generation iPad is the display. Now, as far as resolution goes, both of them are very high resolution. I didn't have any problems between those two. But the original iPad does not have a laminated display. It's really reflective to light in a way that the iPad Air is not. The iPad Air is really good for use outdoors. The 7th generation iPad is not bad to use outdoors, but it does reflect a lot more light, so it can be harder to use. You can see it in the display a lot more than you can on the iPad Air, and I'll try to show that in video if I can. But the most annoying thing for me personally that I noticed between the two is the sound. This may be something that's not as applicable to people that don't use the Apple Pencil, but I love using my iPad for taking notes in class. And when I use the Apple Pencil on both of these displays, the iPad 7th generation with that air gap just makes more noise. It just clicks more and it's just louder. I get used to it, it goes away, but it is annoying, and not only can I hear it, but the people around me can hear it. And when everyone else is writing with a pen on a piece of paper and they can't hear anything, but you're over here tip-tapping away on your iPad, it can be a lot louder than the people around you. Next, I'm going to talk about the storage capacity. We kind of briefly touched on it at the beginning of the video, but there is quite a difference between the entry-level 7th generation iPad and the entry-level iPad Air in terms of storage quantity. There's twice as much storage in the iPad Air from the first price point than there is on the 7th generation iPad. It starts at 32 gigabytes on the 7th gen iPad and it starts at 64 gigabytes on the iPad Air. 32 gigabytes is just not a lot. I haven't had this 7th generation iPad long enough to put everything I have on it and see if I run out of storage, but I've been using the iPad Air for a couple of months now, and I did purchase the 64 gigabyte version because I wasn't planning on putting a whole bunch of stuff on it, but I've used well over 32 gigabytes on it already, so I know if I were using the 7th generation iPad 32 gig model as my main iPad, I would have well run out of storage by now, and I've only had it a couple of months. But the 64 gigabytes on the iPad Air is definitely manageable for me. The last big, huge difference that I would say between these two iPads is the processor power. And I'll be honest, saying that it's a huge difference is really quite a stretch. Using the 7th generation iPad, I did experience a couple slowdowns and 1 or 2 times that it did freeze up for 1 to 2 seconds and then just kept going. And I could tell that, playing really cool, like high quality 3D games and stuff like that is not exactly what this iPad was designed for. It does them well enough. I can't say that any problems that I've had with the 7th generation iPad have stopped me from using it. All of them have worked themselves out in 1 to 2 seconds, so it really wasn't that big of a deal. But I've never experienced anything like that on my iPad Air. It's been a smooth experience through and through. The 7th generation iPad has the A10 Fusion chip, which is actually the same processor as last year's model. So really the biggest difference between last year's 9.7 inch iPad and this year's 10.2 inch iPad is the screen size. And I will say the 10.2 inch versus the 9.7 inch is a lot bigger. It makes quite a big difference. You're getting a lot more screen space and it just feels like you've got more room to breathe. And so that was a really welcome change, but I guess in order to save money, they decided that the processor didn't need to change. And for right now, it's okay. Most of the things that I do are plenty capable on the 7th gen iPad, but I am worried about the future. Because if I'm already experiencing a couple slowdowns and a couple freeze ups every now and then, and the iPad just came out, a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, is it going to be the same story or is it going to be unbearable to use? On the iPad Air, which has the Apple A12 Bionic chip, I haven't noticed any of that. So if you just don't want to worry about it at all, the iPad Air hasn't ever hiccuped on me once, and I've had it a couple months now. I've only had the iPad about a week now, and I've already noticed a couple slowdowns. So it's just something to keep in mind. I wouldn't say it's the biggest deal in the world. It's not like night and day. The iPad 7th generation is so slow and the iPad Air is so fast. Really, they're not that big of a difference. I just have noticed a couple slowdowns with the 7th gen iPad. Now for a couple of other smaller differences that you may notice between the two iPads that really didn't make much of an effect on me at all. Firstly, the screens are different sizes. The 7th generation iPad has that 10.2 inch screen, while the iPad Air has a 10.5 inch screen. So that's a 0.3 inch difference. And while it is noticeable when you're looking at them side by side, it really isn't in day-to-day usage. If I'm just using the iPad 7th generation, not looking at my iPad Air, I don't really notice that this screen is smaller. It just doesn't feel smaller. It really feels like the same level. And same if I'm using my iPad Air, I don't notice this screen is bigger. It feels very similar. So I really wouldn't say if you're really dead set on screen size matters that's going to be worth the extra money for the iPad Air if everything else doesn't matter. The 10.2 inch screen on the iPad 7th generation is still great, and it feels like a lot more room to work with, especially coming from a 9.7 inch iPad. So you're going to be happy with either one of them in terms of screen size. You'll also maybe notice a difference in both weight and thickness between these iPads. Since the iPad Air doesn't have that air gap between the screen and the glass, it is a little bit thinner than the 7th generation iPad. It's really not all that much thinner, but I can notice it when I'm holding them. But in the same way that I don't really notice the screen size difference when one's away from the other, I don't really notice the thickness difference that much either. I can definitely notice it when I'm holding them both together. I'm like, okay, this one's a lot thicker than this one, but when I'm just carrying one or the other around, I don't really notice like, oh, this one feels so thick, or oh, this one feels so thin. So that's not really that big of a difference either. Weight is a little bit of a different story. The 7th generation iPad is a bit heavier than the iPad Air, and I can notice it, especially when I'm holding them both together. But even when I'm away from the other one, when I'm just holding the 7th generation iPad, it feels quite a bit heavier to hold than the iPad Air. Not like it's gonna weigh you down and it's like super heavy. It's really not that big of a deal, but it is something that I notice and appreciate. Every time I switch back to my iPad Air, I'm like, oh my gosh, I forgot how I forgot how light this thing was, and it's super nice to just be able to carry that thing around. The iPad Air just feels like the perfect iPad, honestly. Even with the smart cover, I can feel that this iPad 7th generation is heavier than the iPad Air. And it's just another one of those things that I'm like, oh, I love that I have my iPad Air. It's just so light and it just feels nice in my hand. This just feels weightier. It just feels like it's got more behind it. And maybe you like that. Maybe you're looking for something that just has more weight to it. Just feels more like it's secure in your hands. In that case, the 7th generation iPad is heavier and thicker, so it might be just what you're looking for. So those are my biggest takeaways and biggest differences between the 7th generation iPad and the iPad Air. Why did I choose the iPad Air? Well, firstly, because I knew that I was going to be writing on it a lot. I was taking notes in class and stuff like that. I had the 6th generation 9.7-inch iPad before my iPad Air, and so I had experience with how loud that display was when I was using the Apple Pencil on it. And while it never was a huge problem, I really was looking for an upgrade that was going to take that away and make it easier for me to use my iPad for taking notes, and was less reflective. The display quality was the biggest thing for me and why I chose to go with the iPad Air. And I don't regret it. I love that thing so much. The other qualities of it, like the better processor, the higher storage capacity, that kind of stuff, is definitely a bonus, and those are things that you really should take into consideration before purchasing either of these iPads. But besides that, the other differences are really negligible. So if you don't care too much about the laminated display, and you feel like either A, you can get away with 32 gigabytes of storage, or B, you are okay with spending $429 and getting the 128 gigabytes of storage, which is still a great deal, then you're going to be totally fine with the 7th generation iPad. The processor difference is not that big. If you're playing like big, heavy titles of games and stuff like that, then it might be worth getting the iPad Air because it's got a better processor, but in that case, you're probably not looking at the 7th generation iPad anyway. If your main use for your iPad is, watching videos, streaming Netflix, YouTube, that kind of stuff, reading website articles, things like that, 7th generation iPad is totally fine, and I would definitely recommend it. It works super well. But the iPad Air is just an overall better experience in pretty much every way. That doesn't mean that the 7th generation iPad is bad at anything. It's just that this is definitely an upgrade, and I would definitely recommend the iPad Air if you've got the money to spend and if you are looking for just the best iPad experience overall. I chose the iPad Air, but I'm definitely saying that the 7th generation iPad is a good product. So ultimately, the decision on what to buy is up to you, but you're not going to be disappointed either way. Thanks so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.